Hi everyone, so welcome to the online class for this week, and as you can see from the slide, we're looking at sustainability and considering that specifically in relation to our own projects and how we might ensure that some of the outcomes that we're hoping our projects will achieve will be sustained in the longer term. So not just having impact on kids whilst they're engaged with the stuff we're doing, but when our project's finished, those changes that we might make to different people's lives, helping them to be maintained in the longer term. So that's really what we're sort of looking at with sustainability. So just a quick one, how it connects to the unit objectives. You can see there, connects to the first and the fifth unit objective. And as I've mentioned, it's a section in your grant application, and traditionally not always a section that's done well. You can basically tell who's done the reading and who hasn't for this part of the application. So I'll basically talk you through step by step the theoretical underpinning of sustainability, direct you to some readings, and just give you some prompts to start thinking about your own project and how you might suggest that sustainability will be possible. So first of all, it's a very throwaway term, and often we're not sure what we actually mean by sustainability. So if I was doing this as a face-to-face session, I think we'd have a little brainstorm now and see what we think it might mean. But as I'm just talking to a screen, we won't have the opportunity to do that here. So in terms of sport and physical activity and community development projects, sustainability is often very problematic because it's not really understood and it's rarely considered in the project planning. So to ensure that something has a lasting impact, you generally have to plan for it. And if you're doing a short-term project, that the impact will only continue if the project continues, you have to look at ways that you can maybe hand that project over to the local community for them to run it when your funding runs out, that sort of thing. So how you make your project sustainable will be very dependent on what your project's doing and what resources you have, but we'll talk about that as we move on through. So at the moment we have, literally millions of dollars invested in projects that are absolutely brilliant while they're running, but as soon as the funding stops, the project ends and it all falls down, and the people that were involved in having, fantastic outcomes for it, that all stops because the project stopped. Projects by their nature, what you're looking at, whether your project's 5 or 6 weeks through to a year projects by their nature have a fixed term and a fixed sort of life. So sustainability and considering sustainability is absolutely critical because your project's only going to happen for a certain amount of time. So we need to think, well, what's going to happen once the project isn't running? There's obviously a big discussion of sustainability in environmental studies that you might already have a lot of knowledge on, and you can bring aspects of that to your understanding here. I have to say the way sustainability is conceptualised within sport and physical activity and community development is a little different and draws more on sort of health-based models of sustainability around health outcomes. So might be a little bit different to interpretations that you've had previously. Generally within sport, it's only really an area that's starting to get theorised, and often sustainability is considered in the area of mega events, so and talked about as legacy. So what long-lasting legacy a mega event's going to have within the communities in which they're located. So there's been a big focus on the 2012 games. That was one of the key reasons why London won the bid, was they promised this lasting legacy in terms of youth participation and increases in youth participation. And we're sort of almost 2 years on from that now, and there hasn't been any kind of indication that that legacy is going to hold true. There's no sort of sustainability of initial impact from the games on young people within the local communities. So in terms of how we theorise sustainability, or we understand it in sport development terms, there's a reading on your list by Ian Lindsay, 2008 reading, I think it's Leisure Studies Journal. Please read that. It's absolutely central to understanding the concepts of sustainability, and I'll just go through it briefly now, but it's much better if you actually read the article and connect it to understanding the different concepts in detail. So Ian's a former colleague of mine. We worked a lot evaluating these types of sport for development projects in the UK, and he basically suggests there's different types of sustainability based on the types of outcomes that different projects want to achieve. So he suggests that you can have sustainability at the individual level, which is about obviously the individual participant taking part. It's about changes in their attitudes, their behaviour, and what sort of happens to them through involvement in the programme. So when you're looking at sustainability, you need to look at your project and think, okay, well, what outcomes am I expecting for the individual? What's going to happen there? And how is that going to be maintained once my project is finished? So if we go back to our antisocial behaviour, young people type focus for our programme, you're hoping that by the end of the project the young people will have more positive attitudes towards their community. They will be wanting to less engage in antisocial behaviour, so that's going to be one of your individual outcomes. But how, if your project, say, if those outcomes are reliant on people engaging with your project week on week, so they're not engaging in antisocial behaviour because they're playing a lot of sport and physical activity through your project on most nights of the week, how's that going to be sustained in the longer term once your project stops and the funding stops and there's no money to keep running it? What's going to happen then? Is that individual just going to revert back to how they were and keep engaging in antisocial behaviour? Is there something you can do that means that that behaviour is maintained even when the project stops? Or are you looking at the project having to keep going to maintain those individual benefits? So in which case you're looking at models of how to keep your project going without funding, which will often involve things like volunteers coming in from the local community, training up your participants as coaches and referees and able to actually start to self-govern and run the project for themselves. So as indicated there, the individual sustainability is often the one that we focus on most within the sports initiatives, and I'd imagine will be the most relevant for most of you looking at your expression of interest. Key issue with how this is understood within projects is people fail to understand that broader socio-ecological perspective and how that's going to impact on any longer term individual changes. So again, a project I worked on in the UK looking at youth unemployment, and I've written an article on this with Ramon Spey and Jonathan McGee, and this project was actually looking to assist young people to gain the skills to move into employment, and what we found was that the project actually did a fantastic job with that, of equipping young people with skills, of giving them the sort of motivation to want to engage with the workforce, and by the end of the project they were very enthusiastic about getting work. But what we found was they sort of, when the project finished, they went back into their families, and they were often part of 2 or 3 generations of unemployed people within their families. So their fathers had never worked, their grandfathers had never worked in their lifetime, and this was actually more restrictive than not having the skills to gain employment. So the attitudes within the family actually restricted those people, young people, from going on and actually seeking work. And it was something that the project just hadn't considered in terms of individual sustainability and how to make sure those individual benefits continued over a longer time. The family was essentially hindering long-term sustainability, and the project was actually failing to do anything about it. So if you're looking at the individual benefits and how you're going to make sure they continue, you need to look at what things are going to happen in those individuals' wider lives that might stop particular impacts from occurring or being maintained in the longer term. So Lindsay then talks about this concept. So moving on from individual, he talks about community sustainability, And this is about impacts that you hope your project will make for the wider community and how they're going to be maintained and continued. Again, it's often assumed that this will sort of naturally happen and it is not really thought about. So going back to the sort of the unemployment example, if you're looking to make an impact on the wider community, you're hoping to get the individual into employment, but you're also hoping that getting a group of individuals that are unemployed back into employment will have implications for the community as a whole in terms of developing the community as a more thriving community, one that's more contented, more happy, there's people contributing into it, people are more at ease with one another because the community is functioning well. So for those community impacts to happen, you need to make sure that you're actually consider, well, how are they going to happen in the longer term? You know, how's that going to happen? Do we need to change structures within the broader community to support these group of people going out in terms of finding employment? Is there a need for sort of regeneration of jobs, for example, in the community, which would be connected to this particular example? So for community sustainability and changes at that community level, you might need to look at the partnerships, and that's where partnerships might become important. Programs that are targeting youth crime have got key kind of community impacts they're hoping to maintain and hoping that will go in the longer term. So in those projects, partnerships with the local police, community support officers and the Justice Agency are going to be critical in helping to maintain any changes that you make to youth crime within the area during the course of your project. And then two that might be less relevant for you but are important to just sort of consider is this idea of organisational sustainability. So organisational sustainability refers very much to the organisation that is delivering the development programme and how any sort of changes that occur through their involvement are sustained over a longer time. So that's about things like the organisation looking to secure further funding, having strategies in place to get more funding in, strategies in place to train employees to be able to work effectively. So as I say, probably the two that you need to focus on and consider within your project is the individual and the community level. You'll probably less be interested in organisational sustainability. And then the final one is institutional sustainability, and this is much more at a global level. And again, this might relate to some of your projects, particularly projects that have talked about creating broader inclusion and those working with people with disabilities and using the project to change attitudes and values in society more broadly. That kind of relates to institutional sustainability. So it's about making changes at that broader level and how we make sure that those are kind of maintained. So examples of institutional sustainability might be things like longer term changes to policy, practice, that shape and affect how the sports development programme is running. So as I say, read the article on this and have a look through the different types of sustainability, but I would suggest that for most of you, you need to look at the individual and the community. So think very carefully about what aims you're trying to, or outcomes you're trying to achieve at the individual level and that community level, and think, if I manage to get these outcomes to happen during the course of my project, how am I going to make sure that those outcomes keep happening even when my project isn't running anymore? And just what I'd recommend you do is to link it back to that idea of the logic model that we talked about earlier. So when I'm assessing how you're looking to achieve sustainability, I'll be looking to your different aims to see your different aims or your different outcomes, your different intended outcomes, to see how you've indicated each of these is going to be sustainable. So I've used an example here from the Red Dust programme, which I think we've talked about in class, and how they use role models and they sort of drop into the communities. So for each of these, I'd be very interested to see how Red Dust justify that they're going to achieve the sustainability of each of these aims through their approach, because I don't feel a drop-in, drop-out approach will actually lead to these types of outcomes being sustainable in the longer term. So definitely go back to your logic model, have a think about what your intended outcomes are, and then when considering sustainability, connect each of your sort of aspects of sustainability back to those outcomes. So if for this one, for example, you do manage to encourage young people to change their health habits, how is that likely to be sustainable once your project has stopped? Now, for this sort of project, I'd be arguing, well, I'm going to have a very detailed education element to the project to allow young people to gain the knowledge to be able to make choices themselves. I'd argue that we'll be working with key leaders in the community, key teachers, to keep reinforcing those habits and to make them very culturally acceptable within the community. So, you know, shaping and creating that cultural change in the hope that that will lead to sustainable benefits at that individual level. So this as well should hopefully sharpen you up in terms of thinking about your outcomes, because if you've got quite vague outcomes or they're quite grand, you're not going to be able to justify how you're going to make them sustainable. So you need to sort of really have quite tight outcomes to be able to do this well. So just to sort of finish up there, sustainability is absolutely critical, as I say, not often considered, but it's really important to think about it in the planning stages, and that's obviously what we're asking you to do with this assignment. Have a look at the layers for your project, which are the most relevant. You might only have sort of individual level outcomes depending on your project, but I think most of you have got intended outcomes for the individual, but then intended outcomes for marginalised groups as a community more broadly, or an actual geographical community. So how are you going to do things to make sure that those impacts are maintained in the longer term? And it might be things like, as I said, it might be that your project needs to keep going to keep having the impacts that you want, but how are you going to keep it going without any funding? What mechanisms are you going to put in place to make sure that if you don't have any funding, it can still run? The funding is essentially sort of startup to get things keep going, but it's not essential to the long-term kind of maintenance. Once you've got things going, you've trained people and you've got the community to buy in and they've taken responsibility for it, then they can kind of carry on and move that and take that forward. So have a think. If you've got any uncertainties or any issues about this, you're not sure how sustainability can be achieved for your project, then please just get in touch and I'll do my best to sort your queries out.